Well, hello there, Paul Jackson here, talking you through this week's lecture on m-commerce. So this week we're going to be looking at the evolution of mobile technology and its importance for e-business. And later on we're going to be looking in particular at the role of smartphone apps and how they can play an important part in an e-business strategy. And indeed this week's seminar exercise is looking at the so-called 7 rules for a good app. Okay, so we start with the front page of The Economist from a few years ago, where it talks about the planet of the phones. The point that it's making in this lead article is the world is getting a lot smarter because of the technology that we're carrying around with us. So if we look at the graph on the right here, we can see that shipments of PCs, personal computers, really peaked around 2010. If we look at mobile phones, we see this great rise in mobile phone use around the world. But again, that's peaking around 2010 as well. Now, those are non-smartphone devices. With the arrival of devices like the iPhone and obviously Android smartphones, we see this exponential rise in smartphone technology, which is really eclipsing the rise in other personal technology. And this is shooting up. We can expect that this is continuing. So this is why they're saying in The Economist that by 2020, 80% of adults will have a super computer in their pocket. Think about what we've said before on this module. The sort of technology that we have in smartphones today is much more powerful than the computers that we had 10, 15 years ago. So people really are walking around today with personal devices that are the equivalent of supercomputers of yesteryear. So when did mobile commerce take off? If we want to look back at the origins of it, we can click on this video here. You need to download the PDF version of these slides from the Moodle site. And this was an article on the BBC website a year or two back, celebrating 40 years of the first mobile phone call made in April 1973. Fast forward 10 years, we get the first commercially available mobile, which is this rather chunky Motorola. Couldn't do an awful lot with it, apart from make phone calls, and unless you were a bit of a weirdo, you wouldn't really want to carry one of these around, so people, if they had them, would have had them in their cars. Moving on 10 years, we get a bit of a leap forward. We get a genuinely portable device. Again, it's this Motorola, and the evolution of 2G mobile systems. So you could start to send data, just not very much data. So let's start to think about a day on the road. If you were a nomadic worker in 2000, not very long ago for some of us, what would your day have looked like? Well, you would have had a mobile phone, a bit like this Nokia. I used to have one of these. You might have had a PDA for organising your diary and making memos. You might have had an MP3 player to listen to a bit of music. Probably a laptop. A lot of people had laptops around the years 2000 and in the first years of the new century. Increasingly lighter and powerful devices, but not as powerful as today's. You would have had a lot of paper to read and carry about. Maybe you would have had your lunch and a flask of coffee and a big rucksack to carry them all around. So life was quite heavy in those days. A few years later, though, we get more powerful technology that starts to converge some of the functions that we just saw. So we get phone merging essentially with the PDA. We see the introduction for the first time of camera technology, and a big mover in the market was the BlackBerry, which was the first device that allowed you to make phone calls, operate a PDA, but importantly to send emails. The big mass market breakthrough really came though in 2007 with Apple's iPhone. The BlackBerry was mostly used by business people, quite expensive compared to some of the more mass market devices. And BlackBerry, of course, tried to respond but lost quite a bit of market share to Apple and later on to Android devices. So we can see with 2007 things really start changing, particularly in the consumer marketplace. By 2010 then, the world starts to look quite a bit different. The world is a lot lighter. We have the arrival of the iPad and similar tablets. More and more people are using smartphones, and there's also a related social phenomenon. More and more coffee shops, more and more places with free Wi-Fi where you could connect with these devices. So compared with 10 years earlier, the world's getting a lot lighter. There's a lot of more support for mobile working. Now, if we want to understand what's happening with the development of mobile technology, it's important to think about it in terms of the entire ecosystem. So this is something that Jalassi and Enders wrote about in 2008. The point is that there are various actors in this environment, and they're essentially doing things that are feeding off one another. So at the heart of it, we've got the mobile network operators, EE, Orange, etc., that are providing a lot of the basic mobile phone communications networks. O2, Vodafone, 3, etc., all in there as well. Then there are the infrastructure equipment vendors, those organisations providing the masts and related technology. There are those organisations providing technology such as the software that operates over mobile phones, and of course the companies using the Android operating system and developing Android related software. Then of course there are the device manufacturers, including Apple of course, but Samsung increasingly gaining market share, and we've always had Motorola and RIM, makers of the BlackBerry, trying to fight back in this market. There are the application developers, organisations like Moobaloo, who are very much operating in the business app space, and companies like Rovio making consumer apps. Point is that the more mobile phones that there are, the more platforms there are for application developers to write these programs. So the more incentive there is, more apps there are for mobiles, the more incentive there is to buy mobile phones. We also have related content, podcasts, videos, music that we can download to our devices, and organisations like Apple, of course, providing a pretty seamless service in doing that. And of course we need the portals, the places like Google Play, where we can download content to our mobiles. So all of these actors in this ecosystem, all benefiting essentially from the presence of the others and all feeding off one another. So one thing we see is the boundaries between industries really starting to blur. Now, we wouldn't have thought in the early days of Apple computing that Apple would be entering the entertainment market. We might not have thought about Samsung entering a market for creating things like watches. Microsoft, very, very successful still is, making software, but they recognised maybe a little bit too late that they needed to get into the mobile marketplace, so hence they bought Nokia's mobile phone unit a few years ago, because most computers that people are using are mobile smartphones. So something quite interesting happened around 2013. The number of mobile subscriptions for the first time exceeded the number of people on Earth. So around this time we had 7 billion people in the world, more and more of them buying phones and taking out mobile subscriptions. Point is that some people have more than one phone, some people have more than two. Data suggested around that time that there were about 4.5 billion unique users in the world. Now that's an awful lot of people using mobiles. That's quite a big proportion of people on Earth who are unique users of mobile phones. And at this time, 1.7 billion of them were smartphones. And what we know is, over time, an increasing proportion of these mobile users and these mobile subscriptions are going to be smartphones with the capability of taking digital data. So here we see some data that really bears out the facts in that Economist article. So this is taken from Tommi Ahonen, who was an executive for Nokia, who started producing this annual record of facts on mobiles. And we see here the computers in terms of platforms sold each year. So if we accept that smartphones and tablets are computers, we see that 13% of the computer marketplace is tablets by 2013. Still a lot of PCs being sold, but only around a fifth of computers in terms of platforms are PCs by 2013, and around 2/3 of them, 66%, are smartphone devices. So what we see here is some data from that Economist article. Again, it's 2014, looking at smartphone shipments. We see by this stage Apple still got a leading place in the market, but Samsung have got a bigger market share, but there are still lots of other players as well. We see here the cost of mobile data really plummeting. It's coming right down to almost zero. Think about the use of Wi-Fi. Obviously that is free in most places. At the same time, the number of people with mobile broadband connections is increasing, and that's not just in the developed world, also in the developing world too. The amount of mobile data transmitted growing all the time, again pretty exponentially, and that's not just the case in North America and Western Europe, but right across the world. And similarly, the penetration of mobiles into different marketplaces, it might have started a bit more slowly in places like Africa and the Middle East, but they are certainly catching up. So this is very much a global phenomenon. Important thing, as we'll see later on, when it comes to access to broadband and the internet, in many parts of the world you're more likely to be doing it using smartphones and other mobile devices. So a graph here that really bears this out. So this is projections from 2008 to 2020, and this is showing that there's not just more mobile internet, but that internet is getting faster, so moving from 2G to 3G to 4G, and of course before long we'll have 5G as well. So just a little bit more data again from Tommy Ahonen, and I know this is a few years old, but it's just making the point that, you know, getting on for 3 billion people using the internet, only around 10% of them using a PC, 42% use only a phone, 48% use a PC and a mobile phone. So that's important in terms of thinking through, you know, who our users are if we are creating mobile services. You know, who's actually going to be using them and on which sort of platform and on which device. Okay, so let's try now and put a few more concepts around this and think about the value-added attributes of life in a mobile-enabled world. So we can think of 3 key ones here. There's the matter of ubiquity, the fact that people increasingly have real-time access to data and data-related services wherever they are, and that's happening on a 24/7 basis, and it's happening whether they're in a Wi-Fi area or using 3, 4 or one day 5G technology. There's the element of personalization. We have one smartphone per person, sometimes more than one, but they are tied to the individual and they are tied to their particular preferences, so we configure them the way we want. So we've also got to think about, you know, who the users are, and, you know, if we're creating devices and services on them, how we can configure them and make them flexible for the individual users, and think about, well, how would they want to configure them? What would they want out of the device and the services on it? What sort of usability features will be important? And then there is the element of localization. We can start tying down particular services to wherever an individual finds him or herself. So we've got to be asking, you know, what might the user be doing in a particular location? What might be around them? What sort of services would support them? You know, we can start to think about this classically in terms of providing geographic related data on things like booking hotels and restaurant tables. So as well as thinking about what users might want to do, we could think about differences between users and their habits during the course of the day. So this is some data, again, it's from that Economist special issue on mobiles, talking about never going to put you down, the fact that we're using our mobiles pretty much throughout the day, although not much in the early hours, between sort of midnight and sort of 6 o'clock. What this tells us is that a younger age group, 16 to 34, are more likely to be using their mobiles and using them throughout the day. Certainly this younger group using them later into the evening than the 35 to 54 group, and this older group using them quite a lot less. So that might be relevant in terms of the sort of services that we think about for each of these segments. You know, it's something that we can think about in terms of people's habits. So we've talked quite a bit about products and services for consumers. They might be different to products and services for business users, but let's start with consumer services. We can make a few distinctions here. We can think about the fact that consumers are often after information. That could be things like news and the weather, so there's a market out there for information products. We're increasingly using our mobiles for transactions, particularly paying for things, paying for parking and paying for almost anything nowadays using mobiles. We spend a lot of time using our mobiles for entertainment, so clearly there's a market out there for games, music and similar things. But of course, where did mobiles start? But with communications. Yes, we still use mobiles for making calls, but also sending text messages, email and other data services. So in terms of payments, a lot of car parks these days, of course, you pay with your mobiles rather than with a card or money. Makes it a lot more convenient because you just park your car, get the number for that car park, and then you've got time to go and pay for your parking using your mobile instead of having to queue up. But then there are parts of the world where there isn't a well-developed banking system. So in places such as Kenya, more than 50% of bank accounts are SMS, text message based. And people move money about using text messages. Salaries are paid through mobile, essentially mobile bank accounts. So you might have come across M-Pesa, mobile money, and if you click on these in the PDF version of the slides, you can watch a video all about M-Pesa. So more than £1 billion a year are thought to be transacted through M-Pesa in Kenya alone. So we can see how mobile money could overtake in some parts of the world traditional banking systems. So again, we're thinking about the consumer side of mobile applications, and this varies from marketplace to marketplace and different parts of the world. Here is another interesting article from The Economist, and it concerns a problem particularly in Africa where there are issues to do with counterfeit drugs. Obviously, if you get medicine, you want it to make you better, not worse. So how do you know if a particular type of medicine, some tablets, whatever, are genuine medicine? So this is one application. So you get your tablets, you scratch off a panel that has a text code, you use your mobile to text that code, a computer automatically checks whether it's a fake or a genuine product and texts back a confirmation. So quite a neat application. So there is data that shows that we are spending more and more money online, and that is happening using increasingly mobile devices. So some data from a few years ago comparing 2014 and 15 in a range of different countries. As we might expect, in the early days, if people were buying things online, most of that was done through a PC. But increasingly, tablets and smartphones are being used for paying for things. So we could expect over time people increasingly, if they are buying things online, they're going to be using more mobile technology to do that. One thing we see here is that the UK very much is leading the way in using mobiles for paying for things. One thing we've also got to remember as part of any user journey is that in buying a product or service, or thinking about buying it, researching it, and then finally transacting and ordering it and consuming it, that journey might move from one device to another. So we've got to be prepared for that. We've got to understand how users start their journey and be open to the fact that it may be on a range of different devices, and they may be switching devices during the course of that journey. So we need to think through the design of the customer experience process and the appropriateness of the interfaces in order to cater for that. So let's move now to look at the business environment. We've talked about mobile and the consumer end of things. But of course, last week we talked about business-to-business activity, and mobiles are being used in a lot of, if you like, back-end business-to-business areas of work. Some of this will be internal to the organisation. A lot of organisations have always had a mobile workforce. Surveyors, for example, literally going out into the field, but increasingly we can use mobile technologies to support them where they are, so they can access and upload the data that they need without having to come back to a central office. But we can also support people in more external facing environments. That could be upstream on the supply side of things, using mobile technology to track where inventory is, and also at the interface with customers, mobile customer relationship management to support people in their interactions with customers. So this is how that might work on the supply side of things, using so-called RFID technology, radio frequency identification. So the way this works is items, perhaps whole pallets, are tagged. We have RFID readers that essentially monitors where these tags are and the devices that they're related to. That information is then input into a local server, and that can be connected to a broader network through a enterprise resource planning system or a supply chain management system. If we can then access that data over the internet, including through a mobile device, we can then find out exactly where in a physical location a particular item is. This is a not too dissimilar example using a product called Enevo, and this is basically using sensors to check the waste levels in various bins. One of the problems in emptying bins is you want to empty them when they are full, not half full, and you want to go to them before they start overflowing. So what this technology does is fit inside a bin, can check the amount of spare space in it, and send a signal back to HQ to say, this bin is approaching the point where it needs to be emptied. So, matching the trips to these bins to those that really need it is obviously going to be a lot more efficient. On the customer side of things, here was an example from the Financial Times of Schroders, the investment company. So providing mobile technology to their investment advisors when they go and see their clients, giving them access to all the prices and the data they need in order to work through an investment portfolio with their customers. So what we have here is a graph that shows a little bit more about the sort of technology mobile workers may be carrying around with them. Now, this was a survey conducted by Computing magazine 3-4 years ago, and it was asking the dominant technology that mobile workers in your organisation use to conduct business and to communicate. Now, 3 years ago, and 3 years ahead. So what we see is that whereas laptops were the dominant technology, they're really falling away, and instead we're seeing much greater use and anticipated use of tablets. Smartphones are there, but not the main means of support for people that are working in a more mobile way. So as we might expect, we see a steady rise in both mobiles and tablet devices, particularly tablet devices that have some sort of subscription that enables them to access data services both in Wi-Fi and probably 3 or 4G. So let's look at just one part of this mobile ecosystem, what we might call the app economy. And we've got a graph here of global revenues and projected revenues over a number of years. So we see, quite a steady increase. Note here that we're looking at revenues from app sales in billions of dollars, and we reckon that economy to be worth heading towards $80 billion a year. So even if you only have a tiny slice of it, you're a business that's making apps, you still can make quite a bit of money. But what's interesting about this is that the majority of revenue, right up until recently, and it's still about half, is for games. So a lot of apps, as we know, are actually free. What are we willing to pay for? People seem to be willing to pay for games, but about half of revenue is for other things. Content like books, entertainment, lifestyle, all the sort of things we looked at on previous slides. An interesting thing to look at here is the model by which we capture value if we are selling mobile apps. Interestingly, most revenue comes from so-called in-app sales. So you might get a free version at first, or you might pay a lower price for something, and then you're paying for add-ons once you get familiar with the product and you want to do other things with it. So this is just looking at the iPhone, but we can expect that something similar is the case with other platforms. It's worth starting to make some distinctions between different types of apps. Now, Apple have their human interface guidelines, which sounds a little bit misleading, but this is their guidance on the development of apps. Obviously, they want developers to make good apps for the Apple iPhone, and these guidelines apply to different platforms as well. So they distinguish between three kinds of app. So-called utility apps, which do one thing very simply, very well, very quickly. So they might provide some bite-sized information. Productivity apps, which are full-feature apps and with more complex navigation that allow you to do a range of different things. And so-called immersive apps, things like games and entertainment that we are doing for probably quite a period of time. We might even be doing them for a few hours if it comes to a game, for example. So let's give some examples. A utility app might be something like an app for just checking the latest stock market data. So what's happening with the FTSE 100, just give me the highlights. Or what's the weather? We might have this set up for the weather in Oxford. Just tell me what it's going to be over the next few days. So, one press on the icon and we get that information within a matter of seconds. So here's a productivity app, and I heard about this from my daughter, who mentioned that her guitar teacher uses his mobile to tune his guitar. And I thought, of course, yeah, you can download this tuning app and play the string on your guitar, and it will tell you what you need to do to tune it to get a perfect pitch for that particular string. Productivity apps would include social networking apps like Facebook and Instagram, transactional apps, as I have 4, Cineworld for checking what's on at the Whitney Cinema and booking tickets, and communications apps, Snapchat, WhatsApp, etc. Increasingly, productivity apps will also include location-based services. So we see this with Uber, of course. Uber needs to know where you are. And I mentioned earlier on OpenTable. If you're looking at where to eat in a particular city, maybe you're unfamiliar with it, well, what restaurants are there? But more importantly, what restaurants have a table available within a few minutes walk from where I am now. A lot of apps will come free because they are part of the way in which organisations provide information on their services and essentially promote themselves. So we see this, yes, with restaurant apps, with hotel apps, McDonald's app, what's that for? Particularly one of the things you would use that for is finding out where the nearest McDonald's restaurant is. Now here's an interesting productivity app from Direct Line. Now you would download this app and it will provide a range of features for you, but what they're particularly interested in you using it for is to get the process moving when you've had some sort of incident, you've had an accident, and obviously there's data that you need to collect and put into their system. Now in days gone by, you'd have an accident, you probably phone them up and explain what happened, you might have to fill in some forms, but you could capture that information quite quickly in the app. So you work your way through the app and fill in various fields on it. This gives you a sense of how quickly you're expected to fill it in. It doesn't take very long. What are the driver details, details of the damages, any injuries, whether any witnesses. You can load a photo or two up of the accident, answer a few questions, and then click upload essentially, and that data is then in Direct Line's system ready to be processed, and it's taken a lot of time out of the process, and it's avoided them having to use somebody on the phone just to manually enter your data. Immersive apps are those that are essentially ends in themselves. We're just using them for fun or to pass the time, and we're not just trying to do one thing or a number of things quickly. So more addictive games, for example, we might be using for several hours. We might even include some tools like photo editing as part of immersive apps, because we might be spending quite a lot of time just finessing and creating new artworks with the photo editing tool. Apps that are about content and entertainment we could construe as being immersive, and there's an opportunity with apps to add extra value onto the service. So this is the app for The Economist. So it not only allows you to read the content on your mobile, and actually you can get hold of the content quicker on the mobile each week, because you don't have to wait for the newspaper itself to come through the door, but you can also download an audio version of it on the Thursday evening, and you can listen to the entire contents of The Economist. It takes a long time to download, and there's about 24 hours worth of it each week, so you probably won't listen to all of it, but it's certainly an added value service, and it's very immersive in that sense. We would also include augmented reality apps in the immersive category, so sort of apps that allow you to overlay information about the world around you, the sort of apps that allow you to gaze at the stars and understand a little bit more about the night sky. That's not really a productivity process that you're going through there, it's trying to add to your experience in the moment. Okay, just a couple of slides now before we get into the so-called 7 rules for a good app. It's worth just making a distinction between the different platforms that you might be building an app for. Relatively more straightforward for the Apple ecosystem, because there are fewer devices. There's only Apple making these devices. In the early days, just the iPhone, then came the iPad, and then we have just one or two other devices, but you're still using the basic software, and it's relatively straightforward to optimize for those devices. It's a bit more complicated when you're trying to optimize for the Android ecosystem, because there's a whole range of handset manufacturers out there, and trying to optimize for all of these is nigh on impossible. The most you can hope for is to look at what most people are using and try and optimize for those devices. Doesn't mean that apps won't work for the others, it's just not going to be the ideal experience. Okay, so now we get into 7 slides covering the 7 rules for a good app. Now, this is what we're going to be doing in this week's seminar exercise, and these ideas also apply very much to when we were talking about designing a good user experience for a website. So the first one is to have a clear understanding of what the problem is that you're trying to solve, or what the opportunity is, or what sort of experience you're trying to give the customer. So let's take the McDonald's example. What's most important? Are we trying to enhance the customer experience when they go to a store? Is it going to be providing nutritional advice to diners? Probably not. Helping users to find a restaurant? Yeah, probably. Information on opening times, certainly that's going to be important. Encouraging social networking once you get to a McDonald's restaurant? Probably not. Next, it's about having clarity on who the user segments are that you're aiming at. What does he or she look like? Do you have a vivid sense of who that customer is? And you might be working with your marketing people in doing this, because they might have really defined a particular type of user persona that you can work with. And it's also important to think about whether this is an internal user, in which case it's a sort of a business app, or is it more of a consumer app? That might make a difference in terms of the look and feel of the app, as well as obviously what the app does. We might also think about the fact that we could have apps for different types of users, but there might be users that we choose to ignore because we're aiming an app at a particular part of our user base, and we know that those are much more likely to be using mobiles or accessing our services or buying things from us using mobile technology. Next thing to think about is how the app would support broader communications and tools and services. For example, is it just a product in itself, like a game that we're hoping to sell and make money out of? Maybe it's something that's given away for free because it extends an existing service. Maybe it's something like the Economist's app. Maybe it's something that is part of a broader marketing campaign, in which case we need to know how it's aligned with the messages and adverts that are being put out as part of general marketing. It could be something that supports a particular part of a business process, the way in which the Direct Line app supported making an insurance claim. And the other thing we need to think about is how it fits alongside other channels, particularly the website, and how it fits as part of a user journey. They might start off on a mobile, and we want them to go on to a website, or maybe even to go onto a PC. So just thinking about those connections and making sure, particularly if there's a website and there's an app version, that there's some sort of consistency of experience. One other thing when it comes to apps compared to websites, say, is understanding what users' needs are, but particularly their priority needs, because we can do more with a website than we can do with an app. So that means thinking through what the critical features are, the critical functionality and information that needs to be provided through the app. What's the most important problem that it needs to solve? And we can do this by thinking through, what matters to the customer? What sort of value are they seeking to get out of it? And indeed, are there things that we can take away? So it's a sort of a simpler app, a a simpler experience in using it because it satisfies 80 or 90% of what a user wants out of it. And are there things that we might need to change, therefore, to fit in with that? Net-a-Porter, for instance, the sort of photos that it had on its website were working well, but it realised it needed to commission new photos because they're critical to the user experience, but they needed things that fitted in very well on a mobile phone-sized screen. Fifth, we need to think about the business model and monetization strategy for the app. So is it something that's going to make money of itself? If it's an app that's going to be free, then what's the business case for it and what's the return on investment that we're looking for? If it's going to drive customers to it, we need to have a sense that that's going to be worth the money that we're going to invest in an app. It could cost us £30,000 or £40,000 just to build an app for one platform. If it's an app that we're going to sell, then how much is a customer willing to pay for it? We're going to have to test this out in the marketplace. Will, for example, advertising be a component? We could have different approaches to this, a freemium version and an advertising free version. And in terms of return on investment, again, this is some data from Net-a-Porter, noting 2011 a 56% increase in revenue growth with a flat desktop sales. So we know retailing is getting hard, that it's often only the online sales that are increasing. What this was showing was that it was the mobile sales that were increasing. So that could be a really important part of the growth in revenue. One thing, of course, is that we need to understand the technical features of the phones that the app needs to interact with. So are there some components that are going to be critical, and that might affect the sort of platforms that we actually use. But access to the camera or email or the magnetometer or the GPS system, they might be quite critical to our app, so we need to know about them. We also need to think about whether there are operating systems that we can afford to ignore. This might be relatively straightforward in terms of deciding on internal apps for our own users, because we might insist all our users internally are using iPhones or Androids or whatever. But we might have to make a decision, particularly because of costs, that we're going to ignore particular operating systems. 7, and by no means least, we need to think about the customer behaviour and the user experience requirements. So how will the user be using it? When and where? The example I gave before about Direct Line, if you've just had an accident, you don't want a complicated interface in terms of entering data about that accident. What sort of experience are we looking for? If it's a more immersive experience, then we might put more attention on the interface that the customer is having to work with to make it more sort of enjoyable. A straightforward utility app, we're not that bothered, it's just getting the information as quickly as possible. What will the physical context be? Are they more likely to be outside? If you are looking for a local restaurant, for example, it might well be that you're more likely to be out in the street. Is this the sort of app that somebody might be using when it's dark or when it's raining? These sort of things will have an impact on the sort of interaction environment, the sort of interface that we're creating. So here's an interesting mini case study. This is WhatsApp, bought by Facebook for $17 billion, had 450 million active users at the time, 18 billion messages per day. So this article in Wired magazine features the founders, and this is a quote from one of them where he says, "The F word here is focus. Ads, games, gimmicks, that stuff gets in the way." So it's very clear what he wants the app to do and what counts as value to the users. "We don't want to build a hookup act. We're about your intimate relationships," he says. So clear about the user experience. Also clear that they wanted something that was cross-platform, working across a whole range of different devices, and the revenue would come from an annual charge. So, that's answering many of these 7 points about the rules for good apps. Okay, now before we get carried away with apps, that apps are the future, those that make mobile browsers like Opera and people designing websites would argue that increasingly what you do through a mobile browser does many of the things that you would have previously only got from an app. So the sort of technologies we've talked about before, particularly when we talked about web designs, cascading style sheets, HTML5, and new application programming interfaces, allows, for a start, for us to design for screen size, not for particular devices. So you access data or services through a mobile browser, it will adjust for your particular screen. You don't have to worry which device the user is carrying. With HTML5 we can embed video and audio directly into the browser environment, and we can also access components on the phone directly with the new versions of this software. So increasingly what you can do in a mobile environment is quite similar to the app, so we need to think about the balance between the two, and ensuring that our app experience is more and more similar to our mobile experience. Okay, so let's sum up and think about the future. We've seen that the world of mobiles has changed markedly in the past 10 years. It could change massively again. So we can expect to see more mobile data services, 4G certainly for the rich world, 5G eventually, but 4G becoming available for developing countries as well. More Wi-Fi hotspots and free ones at that, so we've got more opportunities to access data services. More and better, cheaper smartphones and phones that are affordable in developing countries. That's going to make a big difference. More tablets and lighter and cheaper ones at that. And more apps, I would suggest, and perhaps more use of apps that are non-games apps. So lots of opportunities out there. If you've got the imagination and drive and you find your place in the mobile ecosystem.